Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Langer. This is our Christmas special edition. I am very excited to bring our guest on today. I always say that I'm excited. In this case, I truly am excited to bring our guest on. We haven't really even talked about it, but I consider myself a foodie. I do almost all the cooking at home. I do competitive barbecue with my brothers, and I'm always loving to talk food. I'm always loving to talk about the intersection of food and politics and food and policy. Joining me today is Chef Andrew Gruel. He is the founder of the American Gravy family of restaurants. He's got all kinds of projects that we're going to get into here. If you are not following Chef Gruel on Twitter, you need to be if you are a foodie like me. In fact, much in the same way you should never go shopping on an empty stomach, you should not be perusing Andrew Gruel's Twitter feed on an empty stomach because it will make you ever more ravenous. As we are recording this morning, Chef Gruel, the picture of your breakfast burrito was something to behold. What was in that breakfast burrito today, sir?
That was a braised pork butt. It was a little bit of bacon dressing, eggs, 3 different types of salsa, potatoes, and some French fries for good measure.
Wow. And we're going to get into bacon steak a little later because I've been watching that concept unfold. But let's start here. You were not always political, were you? You've sort of found yourself in this political environment given the challenges that your restaurants and other restaurants were facing. Isn't that right?
Correct. Well, partially correct.
Right.
I always have been political. I just wasn't public about it.
Sure.
I actually was very involved growing up, youth in government, Model UN. I volunteered for various state senators. My mother was involved in politics. She was a police commissioner. But I ended up in the restaurant industry, right? And the one thing I did learn from politics is unless you're diving in, keep your mouth shut.
Sure.
So I lived by that code for a very long time.
And that's good. And you grew up in the Northeast, right? But and then made the move eventually to California. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey.
Okay, and were you always conservative, or did you have a sort of a journey in that regard?
I understood both sides of the aisle. I was always conservative, but with a big libertarian or kind of backbone based on freedom, individual liberties, etc.
Yeah, I resemble that somewhat. I grew up in New York and felt the same way. So let's sort of talk about the challenges. And then I want to get into food. We'll spend a lot of time talking about food, but let's get the business side of it underway before we or out of the way before we get into the really fun stuff. So when did you open up your first restaurant?
I opened my first food truck
right.
in 2011.
Okay.
And that was my foray into the restaurants because I needed to raise the capital or at least establish enough brand equity in order to get the first brick and mortar. In 2011, we were still in the throes of the 2008, 2009 kind of recession economy, and raising money for a restaurant wasn't easy. So I used the food truck literally as the vehicle through which I could get into that brick and mortar. So after I opened the food truck, I opened my first restaurant 6 months later.
So remind us all, before you opened the food truck, what had you been doing?
So I spent, how long was it? Maybe 10, 15, 20 years in the restaurant industry, hands-on running restaurants, hotels, hospitality, large corporations to multi-unit, corporate chef gigs. And what's interesting, though, is that when the economy tanked in 2008, 2009, they had downsized the restaurants I was working at, and I was going to try and open my own restaurant. I'd always had a passion for seafood, specifically sustainable seafood, policy, marine conservation, and the intersection of all of those elements with the restaurant industry. As sustainability as a term itself at that time was somewhat unknown, but was booming. I got an opportunity to start a nonprofit with the Aquarium of the Pacific. They were looking for a chef with a marketing background. I have a degree in food marketing as well, who could essentially get people to eat more seafood, but more of the right types of seafood by getting other chefs on board. So I started a nonprofit, or the Aquarium did, and I ran that program called Seafood for the Future, which is what took me from New Jersey to California.
Excellent.
And it was a 2 to 3 year grant.
I know I've seen that when I have visited the Monterey Bay Aquarium up in Monterey, that they are doing that as well with their restaurant. It was really cutting edge stuff. But I suppose your experience with the recession and having to downsize restaurants, that makes you particularly sensitive, right? The human impact of government policies that serve to throw people out of the workplace. Talk about that, and talk about that in relation to COVID and the challenges that restaurants were facing and your response to those.
Yeah, and that's a great point you make. Is that recession? Obviously, we're seeing it to some degree again. Of course, it always takes on a different flavor. But even before that, I should say too, where I really saw it specifically was with local farmers, fishermen, a lot of the people producing our food, and how grander kind of federal policy was affecting a lot of their hyper local actions when it came to food, and this kind of consolidation of the food supply system. So let's shelve that piece for a second.
Sure.
But of course, it was always bludgeoning me from different angles within the restaurant industry. Now, when COVID came around, it couldn't be more kind of clear and concise. Okay, here's the government with a big hammer, and here's your business, and bam, we break it based on all of the mandates to shutdowns, the regulations, and then ultimately the hypocrisy and the kind of the follow-up from the government for anybody who did either speak out, try and skirt the rules, and that's what we're still continuing to see.
Right, we had this case out of Virginia. The gentleman who owned the grilled cheese restaurant in Fredericksburg, Virginia, kept open during the pandemic. Then the Board of Health decides to. It was the Board of Health that decided to cite him, and then it became this crazy Kafka situation. He hadn't done anything really to violate health, except he stayed open during COVID. Then they come in and they cite him and they say, well, we're going to pull your liquor license because you violated the health department health codes. And by the way, we're going to destroy $4,000 worth of booze. Now, thankfully, the state finally sort of, after a big national public stink was raised on it. But there are many restaurant owners who are facing sort of similar choices. And these are tough choices for restaurant owners to face. Do I do what I see as the right thing by my people? Do I stick to my principles, or do I adhere to the crazy demands that the government wants?
And emotionally, it's always a tough choice for these restaurants. But I think everybody also realizes that it's a David and Goliath, and that they're not always going to win. So sometimes it's just easier to fold and then, fight the battle in different ways. And then other people, they stick it out. I mean, Tin Horn Flats up here in Burbank in California was another one. Locked up, shut down, lost the lease. I mean, wow. There's so many stories. There's a few that garner national conversation, but that's just, one or two of hundreds of thousands.
I recall an early lesson that I learned. So I was not involved in small business issues until I was almost in my 30s, and I could talk a little bit about that. But one of my favorite restaurants when I was in college in Williamsburg, Virginia, was a Japanese hibachi restaurant. And I loved it. They had a great relationship with the student body. You could go in there, and they had no joke, a $5 hibachi lunch special. That was amazing. And then a couple of years later, after I graduated, there was a major snowstorm in the D.C. area. They got 3 feet of snow. Actually, they probably only got a foot or so down in Williamsburg. But the restaurant was closed for a couple of days, and that narrow shoestring, the thin shoestring that they were operating under, that forced them out of business. And so a couple of years later, I am sitting down and meeting with folks at Health and Human Services trying to develop a plan. This was when we were talking about the bird flu, the avian flu 15 years ago. And they asked, well, what would happen if we had to shut down businesses for 2 weeks? And remembering what had happened to that restaurant, I said they'll go out of business. And it seems to me that, I understand that you have bureaucrats who've never worked in these kinds of businesses before, but it sort of defies reality that they couldn't understand that if you shut down a business for not 2 weeks, but for 2 months, that they're going to go out of business. I mean, that to me, that's obvious. What do you think about this?
It is. The only way to do it is you have to pause time.
Yes.
And by that, I mean, you don't just shut down the restaurants. You need to pause everything, the
right.
bills. And then on the back end, you need to also subsidize the payrolls of all the people that are working at those restaurants, so they immediately think of the restaurant. They don't think of the ripple effect. And, when you look at what happened with COVID and it seems pretty reasonable and from a common sense perspective that that's what you would need to do. They didn't do that. It was just shut your restaurant down. And then maybe a month or two later, okay, we're going to pause your rent and the government's going to help you there. And then a month or two later, oh, okay, we're going to get that money to you for your employees. Well, it's all done at that point, right? So I had said this in the first phase of the pandemic. And by that, I break it up into phases, but let's call it March of 2020 through July of 2020. In that first phase, that everyone started talking about, oh, we're going to get the checks and we're going to get the help from the government. And where's the government going to help? And are we going to pause on our rent and commercial rent and this and that and all these elements that are keeping us awake at night? And I said, guys, it's been 2 months now. Do you understand that the lion's share, at least 30 to 40% of all restaurants are done? They're empty. There's no coming back from this. The hairstylists, the small business owners, they have moved on. What's anyone going to do about those people? Their voice has still not been heard. And many of these people are now still struggling to get by, and their lives have been totally crushed. But the mainstream narrative has moved on from that because the news cycle's so quick.
Right. That's exactly it. So let's talk about the other phases, and it's not really the aftermath, right? Because we're still seeing these effects. But let's talk about the ripple effects of supply chain. Let's talk about the ripple effects of inflation. Let's talk about the ripple effects of energy costs. Talk about all of those challenges that small businesses generally, but restaurants specifically, are facing.
Supply chain is huge, and the inability to get products into restaurants creates economic hiccups that are independent from the Fed and money being printed, inflation, what we're seeing on that side of the coin, because it creates this incredible demand for a short supply of products. Prices then are going to reflect that demand, such as the way of, the nature of the macro economy. And that, by the nature of supply and demand, makes the price structure just so askew that if you throw inflation into that mix, it's the perfect storm. And that's what happened. And we're still living in that world. Now, this goes all the way back to what I was saying before when I said let's shelve that conversation, is the over-reliance on the international economy from a culinary or a food perspective and a supply perspective is, in a perfect world on a spreadsheet, it makes sense, right? I mean, it's comparative advantage at its very core. Well, if I can get this product made in the Ukraine for $2 less, and it's the same product, apple to apples, then I have $2 more in my pocket to spend in the local economy. So in a weird kind of circumvented way, it helps the local economy. But we don't live in that perfect scenario, and we don't live on a spreadsheet. The reality of the situation is if there's any hiccups from a supply chain perspective or an international crisis, well, then you're left holding the bag, or you're left without the products, and your economy can just be turned upside down overnight. And that's what happened with us. And I've been preaching about this for years, that we need to domesticate our food supply system, from pharmaceuticals all the way to, apples and oranges.
This gets into something I talk about with a colleague of mine who was the editor of Real Clear Health, now the editor of Real Clear Policy, and it gets into the fatal conceit of our small L libertarian policy friends who don't sort of understand that yes, these things exist in a perfect world, right? We want everybody to come to America. We want this and that, but there are real realities. There's a saying, actually, I don't think I've ever used it on this podcast. I used to say the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. Mm-hmm. And my father said, Andrew, that's too complicated. He said, there are many roads to utopia. All, however, must traverse the surface of the earth. And, we have to live in a real world. We have to deal with these things. And so this is what we're seeing. We have the problems with restaurants being able to get decent employees or employees at all, decent or otherwise. And then they're struggling with the products. And I'm someone who I like unique, restaurants. I like to know where my food is coming from. And I have the privilege of being able to, go and say, all right, I know who my butcher is. I know the summertime where my vegetables are coming from. Not everybody does. But I also like supporting restaurants that do that, because we know that the further away you get from where the food was culled or harvested or butchered or wherever, frankly, the less good it's going to taste.
It is. Yeah. I mean, time and just oxygen alone.
Right. I actually, it's funny because I think it was probably in your Twitter feed. I think you posted a picture of a BLT and someone texted at you, how do I make sure that my tomatoes taste good? And I don't know if you responded. I responded to it. I said, well, it starts with not buying tomatoes out of season. It starts with smelling the tomatoes that you do get. It starts then, and then it goes into you don't store your tomatoes in your refrigerator under 43 degrees because it gets the enzyme that gives a tomato its flavor gets shut down. But anyway, I'm huge into food science. Is that a thing for you, food science? Are you into that as well?
Oh yeah, 1,000%.
Yeah.
I mean, food is science, right? So
Yes,
it's
of
not.
course.
They're not even. They're one and the same.
Yeah, it's so let's talk about this. Let's, setting aside the political side of it, you do have the multiple restaurants. You've got Big Parm and what is it, Two Chickens? I mean, I could go through the list. You're more than welcome to do it as well. But all of your restaurant concepts, thankfully, are unique. I think that's an important thing. But you're hitting a lot of different facets. Talk about that.
Well, so for me, it's about, just real approachable concepts, but utilizing the right ingredients, the high quality ingredients, but then also kind of working with the community and giving back, as you'll see through a lot of my different restaurants. The concepts themselves, as I said, there's nothing overly intellectual to them at all. But the stories within the concepts, I think, are where we can make a mark. And, when it comes to seafood, right? I'm opening Calico Fish House right now.
Yeah.
Every item on the menu has a story. Now, it's not a story that we bash you over the head with because we're trying to, get you to become a tree hugger. It's more along the lines of, okay, what's the derivation of this product? How does it play with the menu? What's the science behind the way in which we pair these things together in a setting that feels really like a grown-up Denny's? So, take it down to a level that everybody can approach from both a price and a literal perspective, and then use that opportunity once you've got people engaged to let the food do the talking. Food is the great unifier, and that's what I've always said.
Yes.
When it comes to conversations about politics or any of this tribal stuff,
right.
When you bring food to the table, literally and figuratively, you realize suddenly that maybe we aren't so far apart.
It's funny you say that because I have I'm a firm believer that if you sit down over a meal with somebody, it is very hard to come away with not finding some kind of common ground. And in a number of different occasions, I have offered that to somebody who may have a disagreement with me about something or some kind of problem with me. And I always know that this person is not a serious person if they're not willing to at least sit down over some kind of a meal. The concept, listen, in mob pictures, they call it the sit. I want to sit with that guy.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. I feel the same way about music. Because when I do terrestrial radio, I do spend a lot of time talking about music with folks. But I think you're absolutely right. Listen, I would be remiss. I want to come back to a political issue, and then we're going to get back into the food. Lobstergate, the big state dinner. The Biden administration was criticized for serving lobster. Obviously, the reality is far more complex. Let's talk about this.
Certainly. So, as I had mentioned, and the reason I brought up the sustainable seafood program I started is that we were very involved with Maine lobster and understanding the means by which the New England fisheries themselves were being managed and regulated. There's stock quotas. There's so many different levers that the government pulls, both federally and then on a state level, in order to try and control the biomass of certain seafood stocks. So they're constantly being tracked. And they're being statistically analyzed as well. And then there's mechanisms that they put in place if they see one particular stock is going down and it's a stock that's within a certain fishery, well, then they might change the fishing methods of that fishery to affect the stock. And I get granular like that because in this particular case,
Hold on. Let's pull it back for a second. We'll get back into the particular case because I've worked on this issue and there's a lot of controversy over this, and it really shouldn't be for conservatives, right? Essentially, there's this concept called the tragedy of the commons, which is if there's a resource that is held in common and nobody has ownership of it, that resource is going to be abused. Fisheries are a prime example of this. So the federal government has worked with a variety of entities to attempt to create property rights in these commonly held resources. And sometimes they're called IFQs, individual fishing quotas. Catch shares is another way of putting it. But the idea is to assign property rights so that we are applying these concepts. Our friends at the Center for Private Conservation, I know they differ with me on some of these issues here, but they've done great work in terms of trying to apply the principles of private property rights to commonly held resources. So this is good stuff. You and I are very much on the same page here. So let's get back to the state dinner with the French.
And that was a great description, because most people don't understand or know anything about that, and especially the quotas and the transferable quotas, et cetera. Well, with the main fishery, right? So they have the right whales that are also part of that grand in the geographic region, right? And the right whales have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. The populations have been declining, as have the populations of all whale species all over the world. I mean, it's a result of so many different factors. Well, the right whale population has gone a little bit lower, and guess who's the target? The main fishery, the main lobster fishermen. So they're saying, okay, the main lobster fishermen, maybe their traps are getting entangled with the right whales, although there hasn't been a documented entanglement for 20 plus years, nor have there been a documented death of a right whale having anything to do with a Maine lobster boat or fishing area. Actually, in history, it's speculative only at this point. Granted, nobody says anything about the cruise ship industry, which could be killing these things. Either way, the Maine lobster fishermen, these are the guys that are out on the water day in and day out. These are the stewards of our ocean. They're managing the oceans in a way that you can't do from a government office on a spreadsheet. These guys are out there, and not only are they managing it, but and I say stewards because to them, if their stock of lobster declines, well, then future generations, their families don't have a bounty through which they can make a living. So it is inherent in their business model, if you will, that they maintain a healthy supply of not just the lobster, but the surrounding marine ecosystem, and that there's a healthy biodiversity there. So for them to get scapegoated as these guys that are, perhaps getting in the way of the right whales. So what ended up happening was that Whole Foods and the Marine Stewardship Council first, which is a third-party international governing body that basically certifies, it's a non-governmental organization that certifies fisheries as sustainable by their somewhat transparent standards, says we're not going to certify MSC, give them the MSC label anymore. So they're being scapegoated, and now there's this big push. Okay, well, until the Maine lobster fishery can control the way in which their traps perhaps get in the way of these lobsters. Now, mind you, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to create these breakable lines where, let's just say a whale did go through one of the lobster traps, it breaks immediately. So there's a lot of management pieces in place already. But the issue, and I think where it became Lobstergate, was that this kind of came out, this public, this PR disaster really for the entire situation came out. And then the very next night at the state dinner, they serve fresh Maine lobster to hundreds of dignitaries. And I actually saw this as a good thing. I thought to myself, oh, this is wonderful. Maybe the administration is going to speak out about how great these fishermen are, because really they're representative of true farmers. They just are farmers of the ocean. Nothing, not a word. And then the very next day, what I thought was hilarious, I don't know if you saw this, was that Jill Biden, walking back to the helicopter, they were going somewhere, is wearing like a full muumuu with Maine lobster printed all over this. It's like a big lobster bib. I'm like, I said, this is too coincidental. But they're so afraid to speak about this stuff and step on any landmines because it's the environmental groups, which, mind you, these environmental groups have gotten so large now that they're acting almost as if, almost like lobbying organizations, big corporations. There's so much money now in Sierra Club and Greenpeace and all of these different groups. I know it. I was in the middle of it when I was running my own nonprofit. Of course. So
no, and sorry, go ahead. So,
well, I guess to kind of bring this full circle, the question I get from people is, well, why, right? Why the lobster fishermen? And I'm gonna kind of conject right now, in my own opinion, is that lobster fishermen they're entrepreneurs, right? They're representative of these independent family-run businesses. There's hundreds of lobster fishermen. They all run them like a little small business, and they're the enemy, right? I mean, go back to the Bolsheviks, the independent, shop owners, the bodega owners. These are the people they wanted to kill first. The independent entrepreneur is the enemy of centralized government. They want to control you. And if you're out there trying to control your own success and you're working for yourself and you're filing taxes on your own and you're making money yourself and distributing as you see fit, and you're a freedom-loving American, well, you are the enemy. And they want to centralize all the fisheries, the entire food supply system. It would be best for the government if there was one corporation that owned all the lobster boats and could be regulated as one and not all these independents.
No, I think that's absolutely true. Everything is about control and consolidating that control
Yep.
and social crediting and all of those things. All right, so let me ask you this: how do you like your lobster rolls? You like it the Connecticut way, Rhode Island way with just butter, or you like it with mayonnaise and a little lemon and celery?
Well, let me throw this out there that at Slapfish, lobster roll was our number one seller, and I
Sure.
purchased probably upwards of 100 plus to 2,000 pounds of lobster
Wow.
yearly. I mean, it was just outrageous the amount of lobster we would go through. And I realized early on that if I wanted to be successful, I could not pit the Connecticut guys against the Maine guys. So our lobster roll, okay, our signature is the best of both worlds. So we do hot lobster, hot butter, dash of mayo, squeeze of lemon juice, lemon zest, mix it up, pack it into the split top toasted butter roll. It's the best of both.
That's it. I'm getting one. Because Slapfish is on the East Coast, correct?
We do. I recently sold Slapfish, so I don't.
You did.
I'm not involved anymore.
That's why it's not on your website anymore. I was wondering about that. Okay,
correct.
well that's good to know. Let's turn our attention. Listen, again, this is the Christmas show, and we've been talking politics. We've been talking policy. I don't know if your family's out there. They're coming out there. How do you guys do Christmas in the Gruel household?
Well, we actually go back. My family lives in Florida now, so we
Okay.
fly the whole family. I have 4 kids. All 6 of us get out to Florida,
Wow.
and then we cook there. And we just do, we do the traditional. We do the traditional feast of the fishes leading into
Okay.
Christmas, and from the Italian side of my family, and then we do the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding on Christmas Day, and it's a spread. We're a food family, so. The kids get involved. All the kids know how to cook. My wife's a chef. She runs the businesses with me. So it's always a fun get together, if you will.
So Christmas has been hijacked from me. My mother has decided to do Christmas.
Okay.
Christmas dinner at her place. Now there's a whole long and involved story in that. I'm doing Christmas Eve dinner. You may appreciate this. So my brother and I do competitive barbecue together. Actually, both of my brothers do competitive barbecue with me. We finally are going to be able to get back into competition this spring. And a lot of times we'll make a brisket or a pastrami or something like that around Christmas time. But my brother's decided he wants to do New Year's Eve. We're pulling out the turkey fryer. And I'm going to take Cornish game hens. I'm going to spatchcock them. So open them up, cut out the backbone, butterfly them. And we're going to, essentially Kentucky fry the game hens. But then, because I've decided, my brother had just had lamb chops over the weekend. There was a great place near Austin, Texas called Mac and Ernie's. And they had chicken fried lamb chops.
Whew.
So
Love it.
So I'm going to make chicken fried lamb chops. I think for Christmas Eve dinner, I'm going to do a porchetta, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to do a pork belly wrapped around a pork tenderloin, or if I'm going to butterfly a shoulder. I've done them, both ways before, and then cook them on my smoker and sort of do them that way. Let me ask you this: bacon steak, which I've now seen on your Twitter feed.
Yep.
Tell me about this.
It's nothing more than just a cured side of pork belly,
Okay.
cured a la bacon. And we just cut hunks of it off the side. And then I finish it. I actually slow cook it and then finish it hard at the end so I can get it all the way through to the center. A little bit of that fat renders off and I crisp the outside. And then we finish it tableside with a touch of Japanese barbecue sauce and some everything bagel spice.
Okay, yeah, I saw. So tell me about the Japanese. You don't have to divulge any, major secrets, but tell me about the Japanese barbecue sauce.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a little bit of molasses, a touch of molasses, water, Worcestershire, fish sauce. What else do I have in there? Mirin. Pretty simple.
Okay.
Pretty simple. So think of a yakitori style dipping sauce.
I have a buddy that I saw, a guy from college, and he was telling me I've never done this. So I've made my own gravlax before, which I love doing. But he's telling me that bacon is very easy to make. It's just a matter of time.
Yep.
So pork belly, I cure it and then smoke it a little bit, right? I finish it on the smoker.
Yeah, you can finish it on a smoker. You don't have to. You can just cure it and then kind of take it from there. I mean, really, bacon is specifically just the curing process of actually,
Sure.
Curing it all the way through. So you can have fun with the cure. You can have fun with a brine. I mean, with glaze, there's so many different things you can do with it. Really quickly, because my brain
Please.
is running on these the chicken fried lamb chops. Are you planning
Yes.
on doing like a 2 or 3 bone chop and then cutting 2 of the bones? Let's say it's a 3 bone chop, cut 2 of the bones out, have 1 bone, then pound out the meat. So you have this
I wasn't
big
going
tired.
I could do it. I could pound it out. That's actually not a bad idea. I was literally just thinking about taking the single bone and doing it that way. You do the flour breading and then the dredge and then the whatever the other part of the breading you want to do, and letting that all sort of stabilize and then frying them individually. I could pound. So you think I should do it in the real traditional chicken fried where I pound them out and make them much more flat, huh?
Well, think about it. You have this little lamb bone and then a big fat steak that you've pounded out, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
Because it's
I
like,
like
how
it.
did you do that, right? So you take
Yeah, all right.
cut like a 3 bone and then cut
Yes.
2 of the 3 bones out. So you're stuck with 1
Sure.
bone and a lot of meat, and then pound that meat out.
Oh, I like this idea, and you can get a lot of satisfaction about this. What are your you got 4 kids, so they all probably have very different tastes. Is there one thing that they can always agree that they want either mom or dad to make?
That's a great question.
Thanks.
So mom's really the comfort food specialist. She's going to do
Sure.
the creamy, cheesy broccoli mac and cheese. She's going to do the chilies, the stews. She's Mexican by heritage, so she's
Okay.
always going to, her enchilada casserole is just like whenever it's Father's Day, whatever holiday where there's a little bit of focus on me. She says, "What do you want for dinner?" I said, "I want your rice. I want the enchilada casserole." So
Nice.
and she is the inspiration behind our new taco concept called Lolo's Tacos.
Lolo's Tacos.
Yep.
Nice. And you, what do you, when the kids want something from you, what do they ask for?
I mean, I'm the pizza burger guy, right? Like,
Got it.
it's just because we cook so many burgers, and we're launching a burger spot right now, and it's so fun to do all the cook, and I get everybody is sending me different blends of meat. Use this, use this, use this. We have meat just coming out of the refrigerator, so I am constantly cooking burgers and teaching the kids, and it's a fun thing for them because they can do the patties, and then they can flip the burger, and then obviously, who doesn't love a burger? It's we've had so
Absolutely.
many burgers in this household. I'm actually getting a little worried.
I got it. It's so funny. I got to tell you, yesterday I went to lunch with some friends, went to a Greek diner, and I just said I haven't had a good burger in forever, and it was so satisfying to get that. It was really amazing. Well, listen, Chef Andrew Gruel, thank you so very much for joining us today. How do folks find out more about what you're up to?
Yeah, chefgruel.com, www.chefgruel.com is the website, or you can just go onto my Twitter @chefgruel, Instagram @AndrewGruel, and from there, you can trace into the rules and all that good stuff.
Listen, before I let you go, let me just say this. You sit at a very unique intersection, because you're a thoughtful guy. You have your libertarian, free market, limited government interests. But you're also very thoughtful about your impact on the world. And I think people need to understand that you can have these beliefs about the market and about limited government, but also have beliefs about things like sustainability. So please keep up what you're doing in that regard. This is important stuff, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you for noticing that, because you're right.
Yeah.
They sometimes do not take the same path. They're almost juxtaposed against each other when they shouldn't be.
Absolutely, 100%. And thank you all for joining us today for this episode. Merry Christmas. I am Andrew Langer. This has been the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire podcast. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.